invoking the spirit both of Humphrey and of Mansfield today, I'd like to ask, to start the conversation with the Senate and ask Vice President Mondale and Charles Ferris, what would Mansfield do and say about the Senate today?
I think that, he'd be depressed by what's taking place in the Senate. He really felt that, the Senate and the House really had a partnership with the executive branch to govern. And, what's lacking in the Congress today, is, certainly on the part of the Republicans, is they don't want to govern. They just want to protest. And I don't think Mansfield liked that type of a dynamic, and so he'd be. I don't think he wouldn't be in the Senate. He'd leave the Senate before he'd participate in a place like that. They'd leave him, and so I don't know. I don't know what the solution is. I don't think there is a silver bullet when it comes down to what is happening in Washington. It almost has to be a clean sweep of everybody out of there.
Well, Vice President Mondale, you have been a voice, though, calling for some changes in rules, having had the experience of working with Mike Mansfield to change the Senate rules once before to get things moving. Maybe you could tell a little of that story, and I have to invite you two to use the microphone close up.
I'd like to be out of order for about 1 minute.
Sure.
A story
this is a place for it. Go for it.
About Mike Mansfield's attitude that if there's nothing to say, don't say it. And he was famous at being, having that approach, as you mentioned. And they had a famous Prime Minister, O'Hara, and he was famous for not talking much, for waiting things out. And
yeah, Gary, they want us to.
Oh yeah,
they want us to be closer to.
And
there we go. There we go.
Mansfield went over to see the Prime Minister in some kind of courtesy visit. Sat down. He said, "Mr. Prime Minister, it's nice to see you." And the Prime Minister said, "Thanks for visiting us." And they sat there for 20 minutes without saying a word. And finally, Mansfield said, "Well, we ought to do this more often." Mansfield would be, as Charlie said, outraged by the paralysis in the Senate and the Congress, the American government. I mean, he was a person who fundamentally believed in learning, believed in listening, believed in resolving differences in a spirit of respect, and then getting things done for the country. It was my great privilege to be in the Senate for some years while he was the majority leader. He was everything that Oberdorfer has said. He was a moral leader. He was thinking, pondering, listening. But he wasn't just passive. When he wanted to get something done, for example, he believed that we had to act on civil rights. And during his leadership, we passed all the fundamental civil rights reforms, changing America from a nation that, for God's sakes, tolerated official discrimination into a nation that prohibited official discrimination. All of that under Mike's leadership. When the rules were snarling, the Senate couldn't get anything done, and I tried to get the rules changed to reduce the number needed for filibuster. It was Mike that stepped in and helped hold us together and finally led to a compromise that worked then, doesn't work now because we're so divided. And I don't know how many issues I was involved in where Mike's hand, not necessarily visible, but Mike's hand was there guiding the Senate.
That you had such a sense, and he did too, of the Senate as a special institution, a special force in our government.
Yeah.
Say a few words about that and your observation about if that sense has eroded, as I suspect it has, how can we get it back?
Yeah, well, the Senate was extraordinary. many of the best Americans wanted to be there because it was a meaningful way to help guide our country. Mike was at the center of that. That has all collapsed now. I don't recognize what's going on there. There's a lot of good people trying, but the abuse of the rules, just as we went through with Jim Allen, your friend, and has now ground the Senate to a halt. And maybe there's some movement around the edges. If it's going to come, it'll come first in the Senate. The House has got so many of these members of the House that are picked in districts that they themselves design.
That's right.
So they pick their own people. And they pick most of them right-wing, I could say delirious, but that's not, that's not kind. It's accurate, but not kind. And they will not move, as we've seen. In the Senate, you don't get redistricted. You have a state, and you have everyone in that state, and you tend to have moderates and people of the others who can have a role. If you come from a state where you can have contested seats, you better think about moderating and looking at a broader view. So my hope is that sooner rather than later, those compelling forces will reimpose a sense of justice and decency on that body.
Campaign finance reform is something people talk about a great deal. Do you think that's something Mike Mansfield would be having on his agenda right now?
I went through a finance reform fight. He supported it all the way. I don't have any doubt. Do you?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the last time he ran in 1970, he raised $92,000 for his campaign, and he gave 50 of it to the state Democratic Party because he just went around the state, driving around the state. I think he knew everyone, every family in Montana. One of the things that is interesting that he was not partisan in the sense that the civil rights legislation in '64 and '65, Everett Dirksen was critical for that, and Mansfield knew that. And I can remember one time we would meet in Dirksen's back office, the staff, and then Dirksen would come in at 5 o'clock and say, "Okay, stop working. We're going to have a drink." And the thing that was very, very obvious was the fact that Mansfield's relationship with Dirksen was one that he had total trust. I can remember when I used to write a memo, I learned very early if I wrote a memo for Mansfield to do something tactically, he'd go right over to show it to Dirksen and say, so I'd write the thing from the standpoint he's going to show it to Dirksen. Because he wasn't at all
Guile.
Yeah, no guile, and he wasn't duplicitous in any way. But I can remember one time in the meetings in the back room there, actually, I can say now who it was. It was the administrative assistant for Paul Douglas of Illinois came to me and said, because after every afternoon at 4 o'clock, there'd be a press conference. The press would be out there, and then the cameras would be rolling because there'd be film. They'd have to bicycle it downtown. And so he'd come over and said, every afternoon we'd go out, and Dirksen would get out there, and, Dirksen was a thespian. He was really a dramatic guy. Really was a wonderful guy. And Mansfield would just stand in the background and smoking his pipe and not saying a damn thing. And this fellow comes up to me and said, "Charlie," he said, every afternoon it's outside Dirksen's office, a report on what's going on in the Civil Rights Bill. Can't we just meet in the majority leader's office half the time, and we come out of the majority leader's office? And that's what has the majority leader. And so I go up to him and I said, "Boss," I said, some of the troops are getting restless. The idea that we're coming out of Dirksen's office every afternoon, they'd like to have you come out of Democratic leader's office, half the time at least. And he said, Charlie, he said, we passed this civil rights bill. It's going to be a Democratic president with a Democratic Congress, passed the most significant social legislation in history. And if we can give Dirksen, and you want to have the people realize that it was a bipartisan effort. It wasn't a Democratic job that you rammed down the throat. And he said, you know, if we can give Dirksen and the Republicans all sorts of, you know, gratification now, and we get the bill we want, and the country is better off, let's do it. Now he had no real ego that you see in most public figures. I mean, here's an exception too, okay. But it was amazing, and he was a remarkable guy.
I want to pivot to Asia here, and those of you who served with Mike Mansfield in the Senate also were there during a time when his anxiety, his unhappiness about our Vietnam policy had to weigh on him. I didn't know until beginning to do the research for today's event how deep Mike Mansfield's ties to Asia were, how much then that period in our policy history must have pained him.
I don't think there was any doubt in the Senate from the beginning that Mansfield was opposed to our involvement militarily in Vietnam. He gave repeated speeches, not a lot of them, but each of them were very clear, and the tone was rising with the escalation. And Oberdorfer's book, read that book if you haven't. It's a wonderful history, not just of Mansfield of those times, and in it I discovered that Mansfield had a private lunch, you knew about it, I didn't know about it, with Nixon every month. They'd go over and sit down, and he would give him his ideas on things and leave. And he did the same with Johnson.
Yeah.
All this off the record. They'd go meet, sometimes for extended periods, and these notes that Oberdorfer had on these conversations, in every conversation, Mansfield would tell the then president that this was a terrible mistake. We shouldn't do, we should get out of there, it's hurting us. So he never was in doubt on that.
I was impressed from Washington. I was working in Washington at the time. In fact, I was working on nuclear nonproliferation. And one of the first issues that Ambassador Mansfield faced in Tokyo was the Japanese desire to continue to reprocess spent fuel. As you remember, President Carter, very, very strong on nonproliferation. And the Japanese plant at Tokai Mura became a symbol of countries that were dedicated to a full fuel cycle using plutonium for civil electricity, which is a very dangerous proliferation risk. I was in the position in Washington trying to put the policy together, put pressure on Japan to stop it. But we recognized that we couldn't get Japan to fully stop it. But President Carter was absolutely dedicated to doing this. And it was Ambassador Mansfield, with good advice from his science attaché, Justin Bloom, and from some suggestions from us, put together a cable that turned the president around when everybody in Washington had failed. And this demonstrated to me that this is an extremely wise and powerful man who made a point of understanding the other guy's point of view, understanding the necessities he had, and trying to work something out that could meet our needs as well as their needs. And I think that set the pattern for his time in Tokyo. And indeed, one of the, I think it was a Mainichi Shimbun or something, after this, a lot of this leaked out after the fact that Ambassador Mansfield had worked out this compromise on Tokai Mura. And there was an editorial to the effect that we have a national treasure as the American ambassador to Japan, which was very nice in a way, but it was not very helpful, because it made it appear to the Japanese that the main role of the American ambassador was to defend their interest.
Oh, well.
But Ambassador Mansfield was equally strong in presenting the Japanese our hard cases and on trade and other things. And I just was extremely impressed with his integrity, his willingness to listen and understand the other guy's thing, his ability to speak truth to Washington when Washington didn't want to hear it so much, and his ability with great skill, without ever putting anybody down, to speak truth to his host country and host officials in few words, as always.
And are those some of the traits, some of the reasons that he stays on as ambassador to Japan during the Reagan years?
I think so. I mean, I don't know that. I've heard the story, of course, that they met I think in Tokyo and hit it off. But I think Ambassador Mansfield felt that he understood Japan, he understood U.S.-Japan relations and making a real contribution there. And he and Maureen were very happy to stay on, and it was a great asset for the United States and for U.S.-Japan relations that we had him for so long.
Yeah, well,
That was a remarkable moment
that?
in American history to have a former Democratic leader of the Senate, ambassador under presidential nomination, Carter's. I got to swear him in, I remember that. And then Reagan gets elected, and normally all ambassadors, political ambassadors, are sent home right away. Sometimes a couple of weeks early so they don't get embarrassed way out the door. But in this case, Reagan and the people around him knew that Mansfield was special, that he had this stature, this immense public respect, and he wasn't harshly partisan. It wasn't hard to do. And so one of the most popular things that Reagan did early on, he said, I'd like Mike Mansfield to stay on as our ambassador to Japan. It was hugely and warmly received in the United States and in Japan. Very successful. And of course, as we know, he was not only the majority leader of the Senate longer than any other American, he became the longest serving U.S. ambassador to Japan in history. Great story.
It really is.
I think the interesting thing was Reagan announced that Mansfield was going to stay on. He came up right after he was elected, the initial caucus of the Democrats in 1969. He came up and was coming to the caucus to talk to them, which was interesting. He was doing that. And he announced then that he was going to keep Mike Mansfield on as ambassador. And of course, that just hit their core. They were all enthusiastic about that. I think he was a great politician, Reagan. You know, he knew how to throw, corn to the.
I found that out.
Yes, we have someone here with a I wonder to what extent you think that vision of interdependence between the United States and Japan has been accepted and realized in policy today.
Oh, I think it's a fact of life. The big challenge, I think that the big challenge right now, of course, is how do we manage interdependence with China?
Absolutely.
And I was thinking, Ambassador Mansfield died in 2001. At that time, Japan's GDP was twice that of China's. The largest trading partner for Japan and China was the U.S. Now all that's changed, and China is 1.5 times bigger than China. China is now the major player out there. China is challenging our strategic role in East Asia. And I think, and there are two schools of thought in the U.S. about how to do this. One is sort of a zero-sum game that puts forward what is called the Thucydides trap. It's hard to say quickly. Which means, based on the Peloponnesian War, that the rising power, there's a boundary war. Graham Allison at Harvard subscribes to this. Others say no, that we managed the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and human beings are able to manage this. And certainly Mike Mansfield will be on that side of the equation. But I think he would be quite concerned now that we seem to be sort of moving toward much more confrontational without a lot of high-level leadership to try to prevent that. So I think he would be very happy with U.S.-Japan relations. Interdependence is a fact of life and accepted. He'd be much more worried about where we're going with our policy with China.
This reminds us again of the importance of the U.S.-Japan relationship. Mansfield famously said the U.S.-Japan relationship is the most important in the world, bar none. And that must be etched on a wall somewhere. I think it's still true for the United States. the alliance that we have with Japan,
I think Ambassador Kennedy really wants to hear this, so you have to ask you to scooch just a little closer.
yeah, the alliance, the alliance we, I don't like, the alliance we have with Japan, what that alliance allows us to do, our security presence, our ability to cooperate with Japan, a major policy, not only in East Asia, but around the world. The political cooperation that we're able to enjoy with Japan. They're not a yes country, they're an independent nation, but we have the same values, and I think in many ways it's the best bargain that America has in the world. And we ought to put that alliance and our relationship with Japan right at the top, and I think we are.
Certainly may I say, the caliber of ambassadors that we've sent suggests that we value that relationship.
And they're really happy with the current ambassador. So am I.
That's good. Well, Eric Schwartz at the beginning here challenged us, can we imagine and then create the kind of institutions that will help us keep the peace, especially with China? Or is conflict with China now, some people would argue, it's inevitable because of their growth? Let me invite you to imagine what we might do next, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Well, a lot of it has to be bilateral because we are the two major players. But Japan and our East Asian allies have to be very much part of the process along with the rest of the international community. One of the things the Japanese are very concerned about is that what they call the U.S. and China drifting into a G2, group of two format, that they sit down together and decide the future of Asia. That's not going to happen. But there have been a few times when U.S. policy looked like it might be moving in that direction. But thanks to the very hard work done by this administration and all the previous administrations, right now the U.S.-Japan relationship is extremely strong. And it's from that platform that we need to engage China. And I think the Abe visit to Washington a few months ago was very successful. We've made a lot of progress on defense cooperation, including revising our guidelines for defense cooperation. The attitudes toward the U.S. and Japan are very strong. Attitudes in Japan toward the U.S. the same way. So we have a very strong foundation. Now we need to move out in a non-confrontational way, not containing China, but engaging China. It's a tremendous challenge. The politics in two countries on China are very complicated domestically, so it's very hard to come up with a uniform position internally as well as with our allies, but we have to do it. And I think it's going to be a great challenge for much of the rest of the century.
What they're doing now really worries me. This is, I'm afraid, not just going to be something that we can solve easily. This assertion of power offshore, and it's claimed to have, as I hear it, to have the protection of the normal boundaries of around their supposed territory that makes that gets rid of the freedom of the seas. We can't accept that. No, it would be horrible in Asia and the world if a major power, we never claimed such things, even when we were at the top of our power. This is a very unsettling, dangerous new assertion of power. I'm not an expert on China, and I can prove it here, but you've got a strong single leader who's trying to prove he's all powerful, as I see it, Mr. Xi, and he's not the normal communications that we've had with Chinese specialists and so on in and out of government that the professionals who are here are used to having. They don't occur now. It's just what the president, those people around him want to do. And some of these things are, we better be very worried about it. I think it's an important step forward in our relationship. We had this possibility before this change that under the alliance, the United States would be put in the position of defending Japan under the terms of the treaty, but Japan couldn't fight with us against her adversaries. And many of the Japanese officials told me, if we ever get to that place where you have to defend us and we can't defend ourselves with you, he said, that's the end of the alliance. We know the American people will not tolerate that. And it makes us weak. We should be planning jointly on these things. So I know there's a negative reaction, sharp negative reaction in Japan, but I believe it's a very important, necessary step forward.
Mr.
Yeah,
Deming,
I agree completely. Since the days of Ambassador Mansfield, we have been urging Japan to do more in the context of the alliance in the defense area. There used to be an annual ritual where Ambassador Mansfield would go to the finance ministry to urge Japan to spend more on defense as part of our overall effort. And I think the recent steps are, as you say, a very natural progression. They're very modest. They really just give Japan the ability to do more in a common challenge to U.S. and Japan security, and to do more in international peacekeeping, which you've long supported. I think the issue has been complicated in Japan and in Asia by the historical baggage that Prime Minister Abe brings to the issue and sort of raises concerns about where he really wants to take Japan. But if you look at public opinion in Japan, you look at the broad consensus among Japanese political leadership, Japan, the period, the last 70 years have been the best period in Japanese history. No one's going to fundamentally change that in the absence of an absolute total crisis. So I think it's much better for Japan to move evolutionary to taking on more responsibility within the alliance, but on its own as well. And this is a natural thing that we need to support. I would say the first thing is continuity. One of the most difficult things for American leaders is when Japanese leaders change every year, and cabinets change even more often sometimes. Because personal relationships, personal confidence does make a big difference. And we've had very good periods. A period under Prime Minister Nakasone and President Reagan, very close personal relationships. Of course, a period under Prime Minister Koizumi, President Bush, and indeed the continuity under Prime Minister Abe. But we went through 6 years with 6 different Japanese governments, 2 different Japanese political parties, and political transition is natural and welcome. But it does make it more difficult to manage things. I agree completely that many young Japanese politicians have good English language skills, both in the LDP and in the Minshuto, in the Democratic Party of Japan. So there is a new generation coming along. Many have been educated in the U.S., but not nearly the number of Chinese and Koreans, of course. And that's because China and Korea put a very high value on American education, and Japan institutionally has not done that yet. So I hope that changes. And it really is a big emphasis now. Ambassador Kennedy has made that one of her big focus, is trying to expand the number of Japanese students and American students both ways. But there are a lot of barriers. So I hope people like you can help try to move that forward. Getting more students here is the foundation for the future.
One of the things that I learned slowly in Japan and changed my mind about was the role of the career professionals, the bureaucrats in ministries. We would go to those repeated meetings to honor the new minister, but it's the person sitting next to him that sits through all those meetings and is the key person in the ministry. And I found out, and of course I got the Western idea that it's the elected person who should be running everything, and the career officers should be obeying orders from the elected officers. And I think we have problems with that in the United States, but in Japan, I think because of this turnover and many other reasons, the career officers in the Japanese government are much stronger and more continuity. And when times get really tough, like when we had these 3 Marines raped a 12-year-old girl, awful thing. It was the bureaucrats, not the politicians, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that put together a resolution that worked. And so it's a democracy, but it's put together a little differently than ours. I'm sure they talk, but from my experience, there's very little institutional structure or tradition that brings our ambassadors together to discuss common problems. We go through the State Department and back to Beijing, or from Beijing to Tokyo, but and there are discussions, but I would say that's something we should work on. We used to have meetings of the
Chiefs of Mission Conference.
Chief of Missions conferences, where the ambassadors and chiefs of mission from, say, East Asia or Asia would gather somewhere. I remember we went to Honolulu and spent a couple days talking together about our perceptions and our problems. And I found it very helpful. But they don't happen very often.
Well, they do it now, but they do it in Washington. They do it for the whole world. So it gets very diffuse. You know, it doesn't have the same impact it did when it was done in the region and done just on a regional basis.
One of the things that's troublesome has been the edgy relationship between Korea and Japan. When I was around, usually the situation in Asia is that Japan and Korea, both allies of ours, find ways of cooperating. Now there's kind of a public dispute going on all the time. I think it's been very hard for the Japanese Prime Minister and the equivalent in South Korea to even meet. And there are many reasons for it, but it's very costly to in our efforts to find stability, when one of the key positive elements traditionally in that area of a close working relationship between Japan and Korea is missing. I said some good words about Abe's leadership in these treaty changes or the security changes, and I mean that. But I wish he and the government were more careful about getting involved in things that raise the old historical issues. I mean, that's 70 years ago. Why can't they just let it lie? But they don't. And so one way or another, somebody goes to the Yasukuni Shrine, and we all know that those honored there include the World War II criminals, war criminals. They redo the textbooks that kind of erase things that are embarrassing in Japan's history. They say something that suggests that they're not sensitive to the comfort woman issues. And that just triggers a tremendous, some of it artificial, but a tremendous reaction in Korea and in China. And it's not good for the alliance, it's not good for Japan, I don't think. And I wish they could somehow just get that out of their system some way. We'd all be better off. Having said that, I think their adversaries got some things they should get out of their system. Japan has apologized. I was there. Murayama and Kono gave very strong apologies. It's not a case that the government of Japan has not apologized, but Korea and China keep saying, you got more. And you say, what would satisfy you? They won't answer the question because they don't want to be satisfied. And so I think that I don't know how to handle this, but the first step, I wish the Japanese leaders could find some way to move away from that tendency.
Well, I know it's very dangerous to speak, but last week I reread the Oberdorfer book in preparation for this, and what came through for me again was that he made a distinction between land forces and maritime forces, I think, and he did push for increased American maritime presence in the Pacific. And I think that he would still want the U.S. to have access, freedom of navigation, a strong presence. And indeed, if we're going to have a strong relationship with Japan, it has to have a strong security element to it. So, in both from the Japan point of view and from terms of long-term U.S. interests, I think he would support a maritime presence, but he's certainly very clear about no land engagement in Asia. With the one exception, he did support the Korean War, but other than that, no American ground involvement in Asia.
I have learned a lot, and I'm honored to have learned from such distinguished teachers, and I'm honored that I didn't have to go to Washington to do it, so thank you to the Humphrey School for hosting this event. I hope we can continue our conversation more informally, and thank you for attending. Let's
Let's give Lori a big hand.